Thank you so much for granting us this interview. Can you state your name and your profession?
Today I'm Don North. I'm a journalist.
Thank you, sir. So you were one of the Western journalists working in Vietnam during Vietnam War. Can you share with us how long you were there and what your entail and some of your most memorable experience in Vietnam?
I arrived in Saigon May 1964. What's that, almost 40 years ago now? Almost 50 years ago. Let me start that over again. It is 50, not 40. I arrived in Saigon May of 1964, almost 50 years ago. And I covered the war for almost 5 years. I went to Vietnam first as a freelancer, as a stringer, and worked as a freelancer for almost 2 years, shooting pictures for Associated Press, UPI, and then gradually adding more cameras and tape recorders, and then finally 16mm film. And I was a very busy person, but it was very challenging and incredibly interesting. But because I was so visually oriented, I had to cover a lot of battlefields. I couldn't get the stories that I wanted by sitting around in the Caravel bar or some of the nice cafes of Saigon. I had to be where the combat was. And so I ended up covering a great deal of combat during my time. After 2 years as a freelancer, I was invited to join ABC News as a war correspondent based in Saigon. And I worked for ABC for several years, and then later switched to NBC and went back again to Vietnam. So altogether I put in about 5 years as a journalist in Vietnam. And it's interesting, Nancy, that really I covered the war in what I see as the 3 different phases of the war. The first phase that I covered was the South Vietnamese Army fighting themselves with American advisors. And I spent a lot of time in the field with them on helicopter assaults and walking in the paddy fields, and got to respect the ARVN, as we call them, Army Republic Vietnam, very much. Then the next phase was after the U.S. Marines arrived a few years later, and Americans came and were fighting the war in battalion strength. And of course, working for an American network, this was our big story. They wanted stories about American troops and American boys fighting the war. Then there was a third phase, an unfortunate phase, a very sad phase, where the American Army was in disarray. Terrible discipline problems. They were into drugs heavily. More American troops were being evacuated for medical reasons because of drugs than even being wounded in the war. It was that bad. And there were discipline problems with fragging officers, as they called it, killing and wounding their own officers because they didn't want to fight. It was a bad, bad time, and a bad disintegration of the American Army. And I tried to cover that phase as well. But at that time, it was very difficult covering that phase because the press officers didn't want American journalists seeing that and reporting the terrible dissension of the American Army. Thank God they recovered quickly and again became perhaps one of the best and most efficient armies in the world. But in the end of their duty at Vietnam, they were a very disorganized and disunited army.
Wow, I didn't know that. What was the atmosphere for Western journalists during the war? How many Western journalists be there at one time?
When I first arrived in Vietnam in 1964, there were only about 50 foreign journalists there. And then by the time of the Tet Offensive in 1968, it increased to about 500 journalists at one time. And altogether, at the end of the war, there had been approximately 5,000 foreign journalists covering the war. I might add that although I was only there for 5 years, it was probably the most interesting and most challenging 5 years of my life. And it had a great impact on me as a journalist, as a person, and a great effect on my life, and I think to the best. And I'm grateful that I was there.
So I heard that, like as a young journalist, everybody at your time, everybody want to go Vietnam to build their career and then to experience. Was it true? Well,
yes, it was certainly the most important war going on at the time, and a very serious war for the American people as we continually got deeper into the war and eventually had more than 500,000 troops there. And so certainly for American journalists, for American media, it was the top story of the day. And if you wanted to get ahead in your career, you better put in some time in Vietnam. Just like if you were an army officer, you needed to do time in Vietnam as well.
So people saying that you, as a Western journalist, if you go with either American troops or South Vietnamese troops. I don't know if you go any with South Vietnamese troop alone, but not many American journalists can go with North Vietnam troops. So end up to we report a lot of about what's going on with our troops from the North Vietnamese troop.
This is very true. It was very difficult to get an invitation to go to Hanoi or see what was happening with the war in the North. Very few journalists that I knew were invited to do this. But it was very open in South Vietnam. We will never again have a war situation that is so open and easy to cover for journalists. Arriving in Vietnam simply with a letter from an American news organization, you could immediately get a press pass from the South Vietnamese and the American military, which gave you carte blanche to go on all the transportation you needed to get to the areas of battle. We'll never see that again. There was never censorship. There was certainly pressure to give a positive view of the war and the tactics and what was going on, but never censorship.
So, do you have opportunity or other Western press have opportunity to, contact or talking with the people South Vietnam? Do you personally have any contact or dealing or talking or with the people?
Yes, some, but certainly not a lot, because understandably the language problem. We often had interpreters, and we of course worked mostly with Vietnamese camera crews, cameramen and sound technicians. And so they were our entree into Vietnamese society, and I respected them very much. They were very experienced. They'd been covering this war for years when I arrived, and they were very savvy about how to get in and cover the war, and even though it was dangerous, to survive and get good stories. So I learned a lot from them. And they would introduce me to Vietnamese people that we met in the field. I think we had better access to meeting all types and societies of Vietnamese people than the troops did, because they had very few interpreters with them. But our Vietnamese crews acted as our interpreters as well, and would introduce us to interesting Vietnamese on all stratas of the society, from rice farmers to generals and politicians.
Wonderful. I want to ask you a person named Samson, and later during the war he worked for Time magazine, wasn't it? And then later he, after communists took over the power, he revealed as a colonel, as a general for North Vietnamese. His name is Samson, and have you know him in person? You talk to him?
Yes, indeed. You're talking about Pham Duan An. He was a friend. I counted him as a friend. When I first went as a stringer freelancer in Vietnam, I did a lot of photography work for Time magazine. And so I went to the Time magazine office, and An would be there with his German Shepherd dog at his feet, constantly smoking his Lucky Strike cigarettes. And he was very friendly. His English was excellent, and he would be very helpful to new young journalists like myself. He gave me a lot of information. Mostly it was about Vietnamese history and culture, and advice about where to go to cover the combat in the coming weeks and get good pictures for Time magazine. And so I kept in touch with An. I was not aware that he had been arrested and sent to a re-education camp. But later, after he got out of the re-education camp, I met with him, and in fact had an interview with him just a few months before he died. And he knew he was dying from emphysema, from all those years of smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes. But, and surprisingly to me, after having spent this time in a re-education camp, he was very critical of the new government and the economy and the corruption that he saw. He was very disappointed with the new regime, although he never regretted, certainly to me, what he had done to be a spy for the Hanoi regime.
Sir, you one of the very few or only journalists who were in American embassy when Tet Offensive, Viet Cong attacked Saigon, Hue, and many other cities, in South Vietnam. And you were there. Can you describe what happened?
Yes, the attack on the U.S. Embassy, Tet, was a very intense time for me. It began for me at Khe Sanh. I was covering the fighting at Khe Sanh, and as you know, the beginning of the Tet attack started on the 30th of January and began at Khe Sanh, and we broke the lens off our camera, and so we had to return to Saigon that night. And as we flew down the length of Vietnam, we could see fires burning and attacks taking place throughout the country. And when we got to Saigon, around midnight, it was still quiet. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, the U.S. Embassy called me and said, "You'd better get over to the embassy. There's something going on there. We're receiving fire." And so I went over there with my cameraman, and sure enough, it was a big battle. The MPs and Marines fighting this group of 15 sappers who had blown a hole in the wall and got inside. But although at that time the MPs believed they were inside the embassy, it turned out that they had never gone inside the embassy itself. But it was the impression of the MPs and the journalists at the beginning that they had. So, 7 hours they continued to harass the troops at the embassy and basically hold the embassy compound. Certainly there could be no business being done at the embassy that day, but it's true that they didn't get inside. But I felt that still the audacity of their attack on the U.S. embassy, it had just been built, a $3 million fortress that represented American power and prestige in Vietnam. And so to attack that icon of American power was a very bold move. And even though it was repulsed and most of the sappers were killed and the rest wounded, it had a very strong effect psychologically on the Americans and I think the Vietnamese army, the South Vietnamese Army as well. How strongly they could move on this Tet Offensive, even though in the end it was repulsed and became a decisive victory for the American and South Vietnamese military. But, insurgencies aren't won simply by killing insurgents. One of the most effective ways of winning an insurgency is the psychological factor. And certainly the Tet Offensive demoralized Americans and to an extent, I believe, the South Vietnamese military as well. And it resulted, of course, in the resignation of President Johnson. It made most Americans realize that this war was unwinnable, that it was not going to be won, and that they should reassess it and realize that fighting in Vietnam was not something that they needed to do for the security of the United States. So I think what happened at Tet was a turning point that finally ended in the American withdrawal.
So I took American and South Vietnamese. On the other side, and the place that you left because you need more equipment was Hue, that you were there. North Vietnamese communists took the city for 26 days. Many, fighting bloody and everything. Besides fighting, North Vietnamese communists also have the list. I don't bring my list with me, but I have that list of people that they come in and kill. Beside the policemen, this and that, location like American post or South Vietnamese, places. They also have churches and coffee shop and people house it, and then they kill. Some people said that over 3,000. There are Vietnamese side like the vice. I think chairman of the policemen of South Vietnam. He lived here in America in Southern California. He said over 5,000. And then I was working for my newspaper at that time. And then poor people die. They don't have the capacity of looking for the remain and bury their loved ones. So I'm the one who organized the fundraiser to help those people. So many civilians would kill and mass grave had, and people would tie up and die in those.
Yes.
And I don't see that much up here on Western press. I see they mention about it. And at that time, during in Chalon, Eddie Adam took a picture of General Loan killing women. Lam was busy wearing the civilian clothes. Were print all over the world and condemned South Vietnam like a brutally, government. Why over 3 or 5 to 5,000 people were civilian were killed in Hue. So I can see the unbalance of the coverage. So what do you have?
A very good point that you make, Nancy, and I hope I can answer this question for you, because I've often heard this, that we ignored the massacres in Hue. And certainly we now know that this was probably one of the worst atrocities committed during the war. My reading about it is that in the end it was discovered that there were 2,800 people assassinated, killed, and buried in mass graves. But I think we must understand the nature of news coverage. And we must understand what was going on in Hue when this first began. When the first bodies were discovered in the graves, the Marines were still fighting in Vietnam, in Hue. I was with the Marines at that time, and there was no way that in such close contact and such fierce fighting to release the citadel from the North Vietnamese troops, that I would wander off as a journalist and look for mass graves. This is understandable. And for several months, the main purpose in Hue was surviving for the people of Hue. And so there wasn't a great move to find these graves initially. And so what we would hear a story about a couple of graves found, 15 or 20 people here and there. There was never a story that said, aha, there have been 2,800 innocent civilians killed in Hue and put in hidden graves. That never happened, as you know. It was gradually a few people here, a few graves there. And at the same time, we must look at what was happening in the United States. A president had resigned. There was a new election for a president going on. There were conventions in major cities where there were riots in the street going on. And then, of course, there was the tragic assassination of Martin Luther King and of Bobby Kennedy. It was probably the most intense time of news in the United States. And so this was going to take precedence, and often other things that happened in Vietnam or elsewhere in the world were not covered or ignored at that time. I think it's the nature of news that would happen at times. And I'm sorry that that's the way it is sometimes. And I think a lot of Vietnamese felt that we ignored or didn't feel that it was an important story, the murder of these almost 3,000 people. And that's not true. I think it was one of the most serious atrocities ever committed in warfare.
So the President Johnson, he don't run another term, or he resigned?
He resigned. Well, he said he would not stand for election for another term. But, basically he
but he didn't
opted
resign.
out.
Yeah, but he didn't resign.
No, he just said he would not run again.
Okay.
That's right.
Thank you, sir. Okay. So some critics claim that, the American media contributed a great deal in the fall of South Vietnam. What you thought about that?
Say again?
Some critics claim that American press contributed a great deal in the fall of South Vietnam Can you share your thought on that?
Yes, certainly the large majority of American journalists covering the war in Vietnam were patriotic Americans, and they wanted to see the American military and the South Vietnamese allies win the war. But at the same time, they were not going to lie about it or tell untruths. They tried to be balanced, tried to be fair, even though you can say that they had a bias, that they wanted to see their side, their men, win the war. But to say, I've heard critics talk about this, that we were responsible for losing the war. It wasn't the press that lost the war. It was mismanagement, corruption, inappropriate tactics in fighting an insurgency, and this is what lost the war. Certainly not the press. I mean, we were critical of many aspects of the war for 10 years, and nothing happened. And finally, what I think turned the American people off the war was not seeing the war on television in their living rooms every night, but seeing the sons and daughters coming back home in coffins. That's what eventually turned the American people off and made them realize that this was not their war. Not the press.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate your give me the interview. I just love it because everything you say that what you believe in, and I want to have that in my film. Want to have different point of view because lesson have to learn from all, not from one side. That's what I want.
You're quite welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so
Good
much.
luck.
Thank
Good
you.
luck with your film.